All right, hopefully you've mastered all of those beginner sounds that I talked about in the past couple videos. And if you haven't, please just go back and work on them and master them because it'll just help you out in the long run. But if you are ready to learn some new sounds, then that's what I'm going to talk about in this video. To explain them, I'm going to go back to the drum kit that we showed earlier. And just as a reminder, we talked about the kick drum and the snare and the hi-hat. But now we're going to talk about alternate versions of those three things, as well as the tom drums and cymbals. So let's go back, and basically I will split this video up into like sections based on the different parts of the drum kit. All right, let's get started with our kick drums. We already have our basic kick drum, but I can do the same thing and just make it a little bit quieter. And then I get a light kick drum. Now this is useful because you might not be able to do the loud kick drum really quickly, or sometimes you just want a lighter kick drum. In general, you can take all these sounds and just make them a bit lighter or louder, and we'll talk about that in another video. But this light kick drum is specifically useful because then you can chain it together with the regular kick drum, and then you can get some different patterns. So for instance, if you just had to do a kick drum 4 times in a row, you might not be able to do it at full force. So then you can just focus on making the first one loud, and then the next 3 can be quiet. So it'll be like, so I don't know if the sound difference is really coming through on the microphone, but that's basically the idea. And then you can also chain together these light and heavy drum kicks with a different pattern. And for instance, you can do the song We Are Young by Fun, and that starts off something like this.
Give me a second, I need to get my story straight, my friends are in.
So for you music theory nerds, I'm basically just accenting different kicks by turning them into full drum kicks, and then the rest of them are just quiet. All right, let's move on to the hi-hats. So we already have our regular hi-hat, which is just a that's a TS, but if you want to switch it to just a T, then you can do that too. I prefer the TS personally. I think it's a bit lighter and might show up a bit better on a microphone. But if you are going to do the T, just make sure that you don't pull your tongue too far back. Otherwise, you'll get a bit of a snare sound. So you'll get like... So make sure you don't get that lower frequency in there. If you do, just make sure to pull your tongue a little bit more forward. Keep it near your teeth. The next hi-hat is the open hi-hat. So a hi-hat, if we go back to here, a hi-hat is basically made of these 2 metal rims that are touching together, and then when they're closed, it sounds like this. But then when they're open, it sounds like that. So to do that with your mouth, you'll just hold out the S part of the TS, and then you get tss, tss. So this is a diaphragm assisted sound because you can't really hold out the S without using your diaphragm. So just make sure to breathe out a little bit after doing the TS. Tss, tss, tss. In terms of examples of this, you might do it in a bit of a softer rhythm. So kind of like that. Okay, we'll move on. So the next one is a fast hi-hat. So for that, you're going to go or so depends on whether you want to do a T or a TS for your hi-hat, but just whichever one you do, just alternate it with the letter K and then go back and forth. And that's going to represent you doing hi-hats really quickly. This, you can do this by basically imagining that you're saying the word tiki tiki, tiki tiki, or tiki tiki, tiki tiki, and then just getting rid of those vowels. It's okay that you're using the K. You might be wondering like, oh my gosh, but I thought the K was a snare this whole time. But again, this is a lowercase K, so it's like less accented. And your brain's not really going to tell the difference at that point when you're doing it nice and fast, so that's why it works. So just do it nice and fast, nice and light, and then you can do it like that. In terms of diaphragm assistance for the fast hi-hats, I did want to mention that you can try it without the diaphragm assistance, and sometimes it works, maybe if it's like a shorter set. So if you're just doing like... But for me, I've just found personally that if I want to do it more consistently or faster, then having that air helps make sure that my tongue can move back and forth and actually make those sounds. But again, you can try it out yourself with or without the diaphragm assistance. So that can be used in a lot of different places just to add a bit more flair. So something like that. So you can add it to just add a little quick fill. When you're doing all of these hi-hats, try to smile, because then that will help make them really bright. So instead of doing try to do You can try playing with your mouth shape later, but just as a base, it's good to have everything nice and bright. The next sounds are snares. So we already talked about our outward K snare, and that's pretty good. It's a pretty solid basic snare, and it's not too loud, and there's a lot of variation that you can do just by changing the shape of your mouth, which I'll show more in another video, but just like that. It's pretty cool. But there is one more snare that I think is very useful, and that is the PF snare. So it's just P and F. You just say the two letters together, and it sounds like this. I'll show it up close. Just like that. Make sure that both the P and the F are nice and strong, because if you just make the F strong and your P's not very strong, then it'll be like, it'll mostly just sound like you breathing. And if the P is strong but the F isn't, then it'll just kind of sound like a bass kick. So you have to make sure that both of them are strong. And again, try to make it nice and short. So cut out that breathiness, cut down on that duration, and just focus on the PF sound. So this snare is good because it is more powerful than an outward K snare, because you can add more diaphragm to it. So again, this is one of those diaphragm assisted sounds. So you can do it without your diaphragm. It sounds like this. But when you add a bit of diaphragm, it gets much, much louder, which is very useful, especially for very intense parts of a song. Okay, before I forget, I'll just do an example with the PF snare in a beat. So, for instance, when I was doing Jericho last year for the competition, I would start out the song with the outward K snare because it was a bit softer. So, and then after the second verse, I made it a lot louder, and I decided to use a PF snare. So it became just like that. Okay, I'll move on to the cymbals now. So this is a whole new category, and basically think of the letters S, H. And then you'll have to add something in front. So either a P, a T, or a K is pretty common. And then you get psh, tsh, and ksh. Those make your cymbals. So it's kind of like you're hitting the cymbal and then it rings out. These are used pretty sparingly, usually, for a little bit of extra emphasis here and there, or sometimes they help to end off a beat, especially if you're just dropping the beat and then going into a different section. Again, try to smile while you're doing the cymbals as well, because they're nice and bright sounds. And I'll do a little example of a cymbal now. So for example, you could use it to end off a beat. Just like that at the very end of a song, or maybe if you have a beat drop into a bridge or something like that. And you can also use them more regularly through a chorus or something if you want to add a bit more emphasis. Just like that. So try to listen along to some songs and try to hear where they actually use the cymbals, and you can use them in the same spots. I'm going to move on. We have the toms now. Again, this is a new category. There are a lot of different ways to make a tom sound. And the ways that I'm going to show you are, I'm going to write them on the screen now. So they involve using the letters D and G and then using various different consonants and vowels right afterwards. So you either have dum, do, goof, doof, or goof. And this is a slight exception to principle number 2, clarity, because you actually want to keep the vocalization a little bit. So you actually want to say and oo and v a little bit, because that actually helps to get the sound of the toms. The toms each have a pitch to them. So if I go back, do 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 do, you can hear that they actually have a pitch. So you want to actually keep that when you make the tom sound. So yeah, try to say dum do goof doof goof, and make sure that you have pressure behind the first letter, so that D or that G. Otherwise, it's just going to sound like you're singing. So dum 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 dum, as opposed to dum 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 dum. That kind of just sounds like you're saying the word dum. But if you make it nice and strong, dum 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 dum, that makes it a bit better. Also, you can use your lips to cover your mouth more so that it sounds less like singing. So if you were to sing ooh, like do, then you'd be like do, 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 do. But if you're doing a tom sound, then you can close your mouth out off a bit more, and then it would sound more like that. And then basically take those toms, and then you can pitch them up and down. And then keep in mind that for a drum kit, usually there's only 3 pitches, but you could do as many pitches as you want. But yeah, so for example, if I wanted to do something like just like that. If you want to chain different toms together, it's usually easier to alternate between the D and the G. So instead of going do 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 do, you'd probably do do goo do goo do goo do goo. Just like that. So that's how you can chain those toms together. These are useful. They're kind of like snares, but less accentuated. And you can add them in various different parts. They're also useful right before a beat drop, for instance. So, for example, could do something like this. Just like that. So that's an example of using the toms. Just a quick little note before I move on. The toms are all diaphragm assisted because you have to use your diaphragm in order to actually make those pitches. So dum dum doo doo doo. You can't do it without your diaphragm, because then it just sounds like, which you can try, but it's not going to get the same effect. All right, I'm going to move on now to the auxiliary sounds. These are sounds which don't show up on the drum kit, but they're useful to know. So the first sound is a tongue roll. So if you know how to roll your R's, then just do the same thing, but cut out the vocalization. And then you can add it and mix it with a bunch of other sounds. This is a diaphragm assisted sound because you're going to have to breathe out in order to roll your R's if you haven't done that before. And for example, you can mix it with a bass kick. So instead of RR, which is the sound for rolling the tongue, then you can make it BRR, which would be make sure that B is still strong. Don't lose out on the strength just because you're mixing it with something else. And then you can also mix it with a snare, for instance. So you can honestly mix it wherever you want, wherever you think it's useful, but those are some places that I find pretty useful. So you could go just like that. All right, now we have our last sound for this module, and that is the tongue click. So it's something I showed in one of the earlier videos. Basically, you just click your tongue, just like that. And it comes from touching your tongue on the roof of your mouth and letting your tongue go. So I can zoom in for that one. So it's different. I'm not like letting my tongue slap down onto the bottom of my mouth. I'm just pulling it really forcefully off the top. So like, do I have something? Well, if I just put my finger like that, my finger's now disgusting. But anyways, the sound is coming from the top of my mouth, not from the bottom of my mouth. This is different from me doing, because in that case, the sound is coming from the bottom of my mouth. And then if I tried to put my finger, I wouldn't actually make the sound anymore. So again, just make sure that you're getting that sound from the top of your mouth and then pulling your tongue down. A quick note about the 2 tongue clicks that I just mentioned. Honestly, they're both valid, but I would suggest that you learn the first one because it can be louder since you can generate a lot more pressure off the top of your mouth, and you can also do it faster versus the one where you do it on the bottom of your mouth. But honestly, both are valid. They give a slightly different sound. So for instance, for the top one, whereas if I try to change the volume on the bottom one, I can't change it very much. And then also I can do the top one pretty fast. Whereas the bottom one is like... So just keep that in mind and try to learn the first tongue click instead. So whenever it says the letter C in this guide, just assume that I'm only talking about the first type of tongue click. The block click is pretty useful because it's pretty light. It can replace a snare drum. So I don't know if you've heard the Snoop Dogg thing, but basically the way that goes is like this. So that's an example of using the tongue click. And then basically if you learn how to sing on top of it, then it sounds like Snoop. Anyways, you don't have to learn how to sing on top of it, but that's just an example of using the tongue click. So it's nice and soft and adds a little bit of extra texture to the sound. Okay, so with all of these sounds, you can do pretty much any song, in my opinion. Again, you might not be 100% accurate. You might not sound the exact same as the actual song, but I think that's okay because, well, it's beatbox anyways, and you're not the soloist. And so as long as you're loud and clear and consistent, that's really what's important, as long as you can carry the general feel of the song and tempo and groove. All of the sounds that I've talked about in this video are going to be included in the written guide, and they're going to have all the abbreviations and stuff like that included. Maybe I'll add some pictures. We'll see. But yeah, I'll put them all in the written guide so that you can refer back to them easily. Okay, so now that you have all these new sounds to play around with, I want to give you some more details and tips on your practice routine, and that's what I'll go over in the next video. See you there.